Section 26 of Brazil and the River Plate in 1868. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Brazil and the River Plate in 1868 by William Hadfield. The Republic of Paraguay. The long and sanguinary conflict which the despotic ruler of this country has been enabled, from various causes, to maintain against the allied arms of Brazil and the other Platine states, has naturally excited considerable curiosity in Europe to know something of its past history, people, and form of government. In order to arrive at a correct judgment in respect of this singular people, and of their political and social condition, it is absolutely necessary to go back to the time when the Jesuits exercised so potential an influence in the River Plate, as in other parts of South America, where the members of this remarkable order were permitted to carry out their questionable designs for the religious subjection and social domination of the aboriginal inhabitants. The Jesuits first arrived in Paraguay at the beginning of the 17th century, when they obtained from Spain the concession of a vast territory of their own choosing, traversed by the Parana and Uruguay rivers, and capable of growing a great variety of products, including the sugar cane, indigo, cotton, tropical fruits of every description, and almost every kind of edible root and vegetable. The forests contained woods of the most valuable character, and the region in question also possessed great mineral wealth. The fathers, having established themselves in their conceded territory, forthwith set about devising schemes for its population by civilized, at least subjected, Indians. The means adopted were characteristic. Azara describes the ingenious, if not very ingenious, system adapted for this purpose. Having failed in their attempts to subdue the wilder Indian tribes, the fathers soon directed their efforts to the reduction of the Guaranis, who were of a milder and more tractable temperament. By great industry and by dint of patience, a small community was formed, over whom the Jesuits possessed the most entire control, and whose members were used for the reduction of savages in much the same fashion as the fowler uses his call birds for the capture of others. The following is a brief description of the method usually adopted. They sent to a savage community some small presents by two Indians speaking the same language, and who had been chosen in their oldest communities. They repeated these embassies and presents at different times, the messengers always stating that they were sent by a Jesuit who loved them tenderly, who desired to come and live in their midst, and to procure for them other objects of greater value, including herds of cows, in order that they might have food to eat without exposing themselves to fatigue. The Indians accepted these offers, and the Jesuits started with what he had promised, accompanied by a considerable number of Indians, selected from amongst those of their early reductiones. These Indians remained with the Jesuit, as they were needed to build a house for the curate and to take care of the cows. These were very soon destroyed, for the Indians only thought of eating them. The savages asked for more cows, and they were brought by additional Indians chosen like the first, and the whole of them remained on the spot, under the pretext of building a church and other edifices, and of cultivating maize, the yucca root, etc., for the Jesuit and for all the others. Food, the affability of the priest, the good conduct of the Indians who had brought the cattle, festivals and music, the absence of every appearance of subjection, attracted to this settlement all the savage Indians in the neighborhood. When the priest saw that his selected Indians greatly exceeded the savages in numbers, he caused the latter to be surrounded on a determined day by his people, and mildly told them, in a few words, that it was not just their brethren should work for them, that it was therefore necessary they should cultivate the earth and learn trades, and that the women should spin. A few appeared dissatisfied, but they perceived the superiority of the Indians of the curate, and as the latter was careful to caress some and punish others with moderation, while exercising a surveillance over all for a time, the new mission was at length entirely and successfully formed. The internal government of the Jesuits was quite as peculiar as the proceedings by which they widened their influence and brought the outlying savage populations under control. From the Indians, an unquestioning and absolute submission was exacted, and the hours and the nature of their labors were fixed without appeal by their clerical masters. Monsieur Quentin, in his very interesting work, translated from the French by Mr. Dunlop, thus depicts the interior life of these redactions, the name given to their establishments by the Jesuits themselves. The Indians knew no other authority than that of the Father. The Father fed and clothed them, and promised the joys of paradise as the reward of their submission and assiduity and labor. They lived in common, they worked in common, they prayed in common, under the direction of the Father, who was the representative of God. The Indian labored, but nothing belonged to him individually. Everything was the property of the whole community. The Father distributed amongst the different families the things necessary for their sustenance, and the remainder was carefully stored and guarded in immense warehouses. The Indians had nothing to do with the traffic. The father it was who sold in distant markets the precious woods cut in the forests, the Paraguayan tea, the tobacco, and the hides. He it was who brought back fine garments, the most beautiful of which were given to the most docile and submissive, and returned with implements of agriculture, looms for the weaving of cotton, and splendid stuffs for the adornment of the chapel on holidays, when work was suspended and the bells sent forth jubilant peals. These days were days of high festival in the Redacción. The fathers of the neighboring missions assembled. They invested themselves in copes resplendent with gold. Children clothed in white robe carried censers, which they waved to and fro, and the whole population, in good order, and to the sound of music, slowly advanced, singing canticles as they went under the shade of the orange trees which fringed their path. The Indians were, it will be seen, entirely deprived of liberty. They were not allowed to do anything of their own motion. They could engage in no private pursuits, and there was, therefore, wanting every stimulus to individual elevation. A dead level was created, above which none rose save by grace and selection of the priests themselves. But in return for their confiscated freedom of action, the Indians were relieved of all care for the morrow, and otherwise the Jesuit fathers, it must be confessed, were at pains to make despotism sweet and not bitter. The labor tasks imposed were in no sort onerous, and, as Azara remarks, they were amused by a great number of balls, fetes, and tournaments, on which occasions the actors were invariably clothed in the most costly and magnificent vestments to be had in Europe. To the aspiring, cultured, exalted spirit, slavery in a gilded cage would be simply intolerable, but in the case of the Guarani Indians it was very different. They were slaves, and they were perfectly contented with their slavery. The fathers were very careful to prevent their neophytes from acquiring the Spanish language. Only a few, who occupied certain subordinate offices, were trusted with this knowledge, for the fathers were well aware that the only basis on which their system could possibly rest secure was that of universal ignorance. Every channel of information or of communication was in consequence rigorously closed and barricaded by the institution of the most exclusive regulations. Education was summed up in the oral teaching, they were not taught to read or write, of certain church prayers and the 10 Commandments, and the time not monopolized by labor, or in the childish games provided for their relaxation, was devoted to exercises of piety and worship, according to the pompous ritual of the Romish Church. When, therefore, for reasons and under circumstances which I will not now stay to particularize, the Jesuits were expelled from the River Plate and were compelled to abandon their missions, the pretentious fabric they had raised, possessing in itself no sustaining power, collapsed almost immediately. The withdrawal of the fathers was an inexorable call to their former disciples to self-thought and self-action. They were, however, unequal to the demands of the situation. Everything fell into disorder, and villages in ruins, fields untilled, yerbales destroyed, at once demonstrate the grandeur and the fragility of the work undertaken by the learned ambition of the Jesuits. But the labors of the fathers were far from fruitless. They had sedulously cultivated amongst the Guarani populations of Paraguay sentiments of obedience and fanaticism, and, incapable of managing their own affairs, they have always reposed their destinies in the hands of some authority, invested with the power, as with the title, El Supremo. The history of this people, since the expulsion of the Jesuits, is, therefore, that of a succession of tyrannies. When all the neighboring countries were engaged in a bloody war for the attainment of their independence, no throb for liberty disturbed the popular heart of Paraguay. The metropolitan supremacy was exposed to no tumultuous assault, and was subverted only when its official guardians betrayed their trust. The nation allowed itself to pass from one master to another, just like a herd of cattle, without protest and without the manifestation of any special interest. But to the new authority as to the old they rendered the same homage of unreasoning and unreflecting obedience. It is true that some forms of popular ratification were given, but only given because they were asked. I cannot pause to specify the intrigues which resulted in placing Francia in the seat of power. Suffice it to say that in 1817 this terrible man caused himself to be proclaimed supreme and perpetual dictator, and never surely did tyrant exercise absolute rule with a more ruthless and cruel rigor. Even the humblest ceased to find safety in their obscurity. For the most trifling reasons, men and women were thrown into prisons and there tortured, often to the death. Espionage was general, mutual confidence was destroyed, the members of society moved as in a desert, scarcely daring to address their dearest friends lest some thoughtless word be reported to their detriment. Francia lived in the most complete seclusion. He was as unapproachable as a divinity. Hidden in the recesses of his palace, no one could penetrate to his presence. He only went out in the evening, and his progress was marked by a solitude. At the moment he quitted his palace, the clock of the cathedral sounded, and all the inhabitants, seized with the fright, hastily retreated within doors. If one of them, by chance too late, was encountered by the cortege of the dictator, he cast himself upon his knees, with his face to the earth, never daring to contemplate the features of El Supremo, and awaiting the chastisement he had incurred in an agony of fear. Sometimes he was carried to prison, more frequently he was let off with a few blows with the flat of a saber, hardly applied by the soldiers of the escort. Under such a government, neither agricultural nor trading industry could do other than languish, and the country was cut off from all commercial communication with the outer world. The following extract will show how the dictator was in the habit of accomplishing his ends. Only a few stuffs and clumsy implements were with difficulty produced in the country, but in times of urgent necessity the dictator knew how to improvise workmen and teach them those arts of which they were ignorant. The means he employed are worthy of notice. He required belts for his soldiers. No one could make them. Having prepared a gallows, he threatened to hang thereon a shoemaker who had failed to fashion the belts according to his desire. By this process, blacksmiths were converted into locksmiths, armorers, and cutlers, shoemakers into saddlers, goldsmiths into founders, and masons into architects. That their zeal might not be permitted to cool, he condemned a blacksmith to penal servitude who had badly constructed the sight piece of a cannon. Everything was done by rule. The citizens were divested of all power of initiation. If they became proprietors, even their goods were subject to the arbitrary caprices of the dictator. Under pretext of embellishing the capital, Francia pulled down several hundred houses without compensating the owners, or troubling himself as to their fate or that of their families. Each was compelled to demolish his own house, and if he lacked the means, convicts were employed to do the work, and afterwards carried away what they thought proper. On the 19th of September, 1840, Francia died, but unhappily his death did not prove the dawn of freedom for the Paraguayans. After a brief interregnum, Don Carlos Lopez, a lawyer, finally took up the scepter of his terrible predecessor and wielded it with a hand equally relentless. He professed, it is true, to rule in conformity with the Constitution of 1844, if this name can be given to an act which merely legalized despotism, but if any difference existed between the position of Lopez and Francia, it was simply that the iron rod of the latter was gilded and painted in the grasp of the former. Without repudiating the exclusive policy of Francia, Lopez the Elder permitted some partial commerce with foreign nations, but this license was hampered by the most absurd restrictions, and he continued to exhibit the greatest dislike for foreigners, upon whom extreme barbarities were inflicted. If the isolation of the state was a little relaxed, it was because the trading interests of the dictator would else have suffered. The modifications effected in the commercial and economic system were of such a nature as to secure for the state a monopoly in the majority of mercantile transactions. Paraguay was and is a great firm under the management of the president. Lopez authorized the people to work in the yerbales, but it was necessary to ask and obtain a license. The yerba thus produced was purchased by the state, which exported it on its own account. The government paid for it 5 piastres per arroba and resold it for 15 in the interior, and for so much as 40 piastres to export. In consequence of the monopoly in the sale of this important product, an exorbitant price was maintained, which enabled the Brazilians to give a great development to its production in the province of Parana. The yerba there grown, though of inferior quality, nevertheless found an immense consumption in the plate, on account of its more moderate price. The utilization of the forests of Paraguay was also permitted, but the state imposed a duty of 20%, and as the value was fixed by itself, this pretended liberty of commerce in timber was simply a device to extort money and ruin the individuals who might engage in it. With regard to the raising of cattle and the commerce in hides, the state possessed farms and tanneries, and did not allow private persons to offer any serious competition. The state could, in addition, command laborers without payment, for the citizens were still subject, as under the colonial administration, to be pressed into the public service. At every requisition of authority they are bound to work without receiving either reward or nourishment, and it was by means of these auxilios that roads have been made and repaired, churches built, and both the fortresses of Humaita and the arsenal of Villarica erected. The guardias auxiliares, today soldiers, tomorrow laborers, are employed in the cultivation of the lands of the state. These soldiers carry the posts, gather the mate harvest, and fell timber, but receive no remuneration, being only fed like the rest of the army. These laborers cost so little that, thanks to them, the state defies all private competition in the produce of its yerbales, forests, and farms. One thing Don Carlos Lopez did not leave out of sight. He felt his government was an anomaly and a menace to civilization and political freedom in the surrounding states, and any day even his so patient subjects might find their bonds too galling for longer endurance. He, therefore, developed the military strength of the dictatorship, and raised the fortress of Humaita on the banks of the Paraguay in such a position as to render the country all but impregnable to internal assault. At the end of a long reign, Lopez I died, and his dominion went by testament to his son, Don Francisco Solano, as vice president. Monsieur Quentin gives the following account of the proceedings adopted by the present ruler of Paraguay to secure the position he has used to bring ruin upon his unfortunate country. Don Carlos Antonio Lopez died on the 10th of September, 1862. On the very same day, Don Francisco Solano Lopez assembled the bishop, the supreme judge, and the principal functionaries, and in their presence opened the sealed envelope which contained the testament of his father. In virtue of the law of 1856, Don Francisco Solano Lopez was designated vice president, and in that capacity he convoked the Extraordinary Congress. As under such circumstances it is well to neglect nothing, young Lopez prudently confided the command of the army to his brother, and one of his uncles was already at the head of the clergy. Thus all the avenues to power were guarded. The Congress assembled under the presidency of Don Solano Lopez. The result of the vote was certain. Every precaution had been well taken. They were about to proceed to the ballot when a deputy, named Varela, commenced speaking. He began by eulogizing General Lopez and assuring him of his personal esteem and sympathy, reminded Congress of the express terms of the Act of Independence. Paraguay shall never become the patrimony of a family, and concluded with these words: I have the most profound respect for General Lopez, but I have sworn to obey the laws of my country. I hesitate between my affection and my conscience. The moment was a critical one. An unexpected opposition manifested itself and drew its force from the law, for the first time invoked in the heart of a Congress. Lopez tremblingly witnessed this episode, but retained his coolness and self-possession. He made a sign to Father Roman, the Bishop of Asuncion, who of right formed part of the Congress. The prelate approached Varela, who humbly fell on his knees in the midst of the assembly, and the bishop, placing his hands upon his head, said with a loud voice, Ego te absolvo, thou art released from thy oath. This is not the case for its observance. No es este el caso de observarlo. Varela rose with delight, and cried, Then I will be the first to give my vote to His Excellency General Lopez. It need not be stated that the president obtained unanimity, and that the people welcomed this new master with transport. The Lopez dynasty was founded. Lopez II, thus firmly seated in his place of supremacy, adhered to the traditions of his father. His government has been equally despotic, and in the same policy of isolation and monopoly has been presently observed. Public opinion has no existence, and the only paper published in Paraguay is the official organ edited by the dictator himself. The commerce and industry of the people, their toil, their means, their blood, are at the uncontrolled disposal of their tyrant. And how this authority has been exercised we all know. Inflamed by ambition and desirous to extend his power beyond the limits of Paraguay, the greater part of his reign, I use the word advisedly, has been devoted to the steady accumulation of military and naval stores, to the organization of an army out of all proportion to the number of inhabitants, and the erection of strong fortresses on the riverine passages to the interior. For what purpose? Let his acts of gratuitous invasion tell. Let the story of the present war with Brazil and her allies testify. I have already placed the facts with respect to this struggle before my readers, and I feel sure they will concur with me that the real object of Lopez was to bring the whole of the River Plate under the terror of a Guarani Indian subjection. Happily, this calamity has not occurred, but it has only been avoided by a prodigious outflow of blood and treasure. End of section 26. Section 27 of Brazil and the River Plate in 1868. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tatiana Chichilla. Brazil and the River Plate in 1868 by William Hadfield. Brazilian currency. Like most new countries achieving their independence and establishing constitutional government under circumstances of difficulty, internal and external, Brazil has been subject to vicissitudes in her monetary circulation and has been affected by occasional aberrations from the great truths of economical science in the emission of paper money. The law of 1866 has, however, corrected the errors previously committed, and when the restoration of peace shall afford the present President of the Council and Minister of Finance, who, when holding the same offices in 1853, evinced both the capacity and determination to place the financial condition of the empire on a sound foundation, the Viscount Itaboraí will, no doubt, achieve for his country even a greater financial reform than that which secured for him in Brazil a reputation not dissimilar from that of Sir Robert Peel in England. The Brazilian standard of value is the gold oitava of 22 carats, of the value of 4 milreis, the par value of each milreis being by law 27 pennies sterling. The ancient mercantile par of the exchange of the milreis was in sterling 60 pennies. After the arrival of King Dom João VI in Brazil, the exchange on England gradually rose, until in 1814 it reached 96 pennies. This rise was owing to the increase of its commerce, consequent on Mr. Pitt's Bank Restriction Act. The war which the Argentines plunged the empire into immediately after their independence to deprive it of its Cisplatine province produced, however, great financial embarrassments, and they were increased by the mismanagement of the paper circulation by the then Bank of Brazil, which King Dom João VI had founded, by attempts at revolution in the northern provinces, by the intervention of the Emperor Dom Pedro I in the affairs of Portugal, by his abdication of the Brazilian crown in 1831, and by serious and prolonged domestic troubles. The consequence was, in 1833, the reduction of the ancient par to 43.5 pennies the milreis. From 1831 to 1840, distracted regencies governed Brazil. During one of the regencies, a civil war broke out in the great province of the Rio Grande do Sul, which only terminated in 1845, thanks then to the efforts and capacity of the Count, now Marquis, de Caxias, who at this hour is heroically fighting in his old age the battles of Brazil and Paraguay with equal success. Then followed other provincial and political difficulties of less importance, but all reacting on the financial position of the empire. So that again in 1846, the par of the milreis had to be lowered to 27 pennies, at which it has since been preserved. And it is to the credit of the empire, its government, legislature, and people, that subsequently neither the great financial and banking crisis of 1864, nor the pressure of the war with Paraguay, which has continued from 1865 to the present time, has produced any propositions for its further reduction. The maintenance of the par of the milreis at 27 pennies is now the established fundamental policy of Brazil. The policy is made especially and emphatically manifest in the financial measures of Viscount Itaboraí, who is once more Prime Minister and Finance Manager of the Empire, with the prospect, it may be hoped, of as long as administration as that which distinguished his government from 1848 to 1853, during which period he governed so greatly to the advantage of the nation, terminating the slave trade and introducing a financial system, the departure from and disregard of which in 1857 undid the good which he then accomplished. The free trade legislation in England of 1845 opened the consumption of this country to Brazilian sugar, one of the great productions of Brazil, and the Revolution of 1848 in France was followed by the partial admission to France of Brazilian coffee, then the largest item of the agriculture of the empire. Under these influences, an immense impetus was given to the productive capacity of Brazil. The firm and enlightened government of Viscount Itaboraí gave the empire concurrently a period of domestic repose, of which the planters made the most. Political passions subsiding, agriculture made huge strides. The termination of the African slave trade, gradually relieving agriculture from debts and embarrassments, introduced better systems of cultivation, largely increased production, augmented commerce, released for better purposes a great amount of capital engaged in that abominable traffic, stimulated honest improvements of every sort and kind, and the exchange on England rose to 24.5 pennies the milreis. At this time, treasury notes were the only paper money in circulation, and their amount was so insufficient for business purposes that coin became more abundant than paper money, to the inconvenience of trade and society in so vast an empire. The necessity of convertible paper money became apparent, and it was generally demanded. The result was the enactment, on the proposition of Viscount Itaboraí, of the law of the 5th of July, 1853. Under it, the Bank of Brazil was established as a bank of issue to a limited extent. Other banks were merged in that great institution. Branches of it were established in the larger provinces, with similarly restricted powers of issue in circumjacent districts. The privilege of issue was confined to this one establishment, and Brazil was provided, as England now is, with one great bank issuing convertible paper in connection with, yet to a large extent independent of, the state, and the executive government had virtually no authority or power to found other banks of issue. Thus, unity of banking was established so far as paper money was concerned, and to the immense advantage of the country. An easy, cheap, and convenient paper currency was provided, always convertible into coin, yet preferable for the ordinary purposes of life to coin, and the provinces and the metropolis were equally well supplied with this currency. The consequences were still further progress in this empire. The treasury was relieved from the trouble of regulating the currency, the revenue and trade increased, and an impetus was given to activity throughout the empire. For all this, Brazil had to thank the good sense and statesmanship of Viscount Itaboraí. The Viscount's cabinet terminated in 1853 in the midst of the improvement it had created. The progress thus produced by wise and scientific legislation unfortunately rendered a powerful section of the country impatient for further progress, and misled succeeding governments into a policy of a very different kind, whence mainly have flowed the subsequent financial misfortunes of the country. From the substantial but slow benefits of sound legislation, Senor Sousa Franco, a successor of Viscount Itabarahi in the Ministry of the Treasury, was led into the evils of unsound banking. He became enamored of the then-American system of free banking, as it was termed, and in 1857, misrepresenting the real meaning of the law of 1853, established plurality of banks of emission. Banking societies were then empowered to issue their own notes convertible by law, it is true, on presentation to coin, but without any corresponding security wherewith to furnish gold for their payment on presentation. The government sanctioned no fewer than 6 banks of emission, 2 in Rio de Janeiro and 4 in the provinces, and assigned to each districts within which the right of paper issue might be, by means of branches, further extended. In the same spirit, the government sanctioned the establishment of joint stock companies and anonymous societies for all kinds of purposes throughout the empire. The right thus assumed by the government was superabundantly exercised. Speculation spread apace in all directions, and fictitious prosperity for a moment took the place of real progress. Shares and pecuniary responsibility, far beyond the means of those who assumed them, became the order of the day. Long credit and increased discount aggravated the evil. Gold began to leave the empire rapidly, the rate of exchange to fall heavily, and in 1859 pecuniary anarchy was the consequence of this policy. Senor Sousa Franco had to retreat before this result, and he was succeeded by Senor Torres Homem, who soon found in the chambers a spirit opposed to those wiser measures he recommended, which he was unable to overcome during his short tenure of office. Then came Senor Ferraz at the Treasury. He was more fortunate in remedying the mischief thus caused. The Empire and the General Assembly had recovered from their delusions. So, on 22nd August 1860, a new law of banking, etc., was enacted. Its principles were the resumption of cash payments by the banks of emission and the withdrawal of all power from the executive government to sanction powers of emission or of anonymous societies, reserving such power for the imperial legislature. By this law, the Bank of Brazil was prohibited from further emission until it had resumed payment of its notes in gold. The power of emission was reduced and fixed, and no banks can now be established except by legislative authority. Immense as was the mischief caused by the measures of 1857, the law of 1860 to a considerable extent corrected it. The 2 banks of emission at Rio de Janeiro resigned the privileges they had acquired. Within 2 years, the Bank of Brazil resumed payment of its notes in cash. The Bank of Pernambuco withdrew its notes from circulation, and the currency of the empire had undergone substantial improvement when, in September 1864, suddenly a great crisis burst on Rio de Janeiro, immediately the consequence of adverse European influences, but substantially the result of unscrupulous and indefensible mismanagement of discount and private bankers in that capital. Their establishments were in the enjoyment of great credit. Their chiefs were men of mercantile activity and public spirit, living on evidence, pushing business, giving facilities to everybody, and dealing with money as if possessed of some boundless capital of their own. Their means for this pecuniary profusion was, however, chiefly derived from money deposited with them for longer or shorter periods, or at call, sometimes in large, but more frequently in small sums, on which they allowed interest of, say, 8%. Thus they became possessed of a greater part of the floating and uninvested capital of Rio de Janeiro. Receiving money in this way, freely and largely, from the poorer public, chiefly, it was the duty of these bankers to place it out at higher rates of interest, but on ample security always, and easily convertible into cash. By such business they would have reaped substantial profits for themselves, have assisted honest commerce, and have provided effectually for the depositors. A run upon one of these houses in September 1864, after the arrival of bad financial news from Europe, resulted in its closing its doors on its depositors. This stoppage alarmed the creditors of the other houses, and they followed suit by demanding back their deposits. With the same effect, the closing of doors and stoppage, until 5 of these bankers suspended payments with deposits of £5,655,000. Investigation into their affairs showed how reckless had been their management, how disregardful of every rule of deposit banking. The funds entrusted to them had been invested in houses, advanced on mortgages, lent to planters on bills renewable, and thus Rio de Janeiro was by their misconduct involved in unexpected ruin. The government had to interfere with the payment of bills of exchange to direct the administration of their insolvent estates. The Bank of Brazil was involved in large advances to these houses and unable to assist the community at the moment when assistance was most needed. The consequence was a suspension of its cash payments. This crisis once more raised the question of the currency and of banking, and led, after a prolonged discussion, to further legislation in 1866. By the beginning of 1865, the paper circulation of the empire reached the enormous sum in sterling of £11,025,000, of which, however, only £3,150,000 were notes of the government having general circulation throughout the country. For the balance of £7,785,000, the circulation of which was limited to a defined districts in which the issuing banks were situated, the public had no adequate security. The natural consequence was disarrangement in the internal exchanges and general disturbance of the money market. To remedy it, government proposed a radical reform of the Bank of Brazil and its separation in two departments, one of issue, the other of banking. The discussions on this question continued through the legislative sessions of 1865 and 1866, and during these discussions the adverse situation was illustrated by further decline in the foreign exchanges and the augmentation of the non-government paper in circulation to £9,225,000, to which it had swollen in May 1866. In the session of that year, the difficulties of the state of affairs were brought under the consideration of a committee of the Senate, of which Viscount Itabarahi was the most eminent member, and to which a remedial measure of a radical character was referred for examination. The result of its deliberations was the expression of an opinion that the Bank of Brazil, having in 2 years doubled its circulation, could no longer accomplish the essential objects of its existence. Thus, sentence of death was passed on that institution by the statesmen who had formed it, and legislation became inevitable after such a condemnation. Accordingly, on the 12th of September 1866, a measure became law which enabled the government to abolish the contract under which the Bank of Brazil existed. The principal provisions of this law were 1. The cessation of the bank's privilege of emission, 2. The division of the bank into two departments, one for banking purposes only, the other for mortgage loans, in order to effect a gradual liquidation of the securities given by the agricultural classes, and so to form the commencement of the operations of the law of September 1864. 3. The sale of the bank's stock of bullion, which amounted to £2,925,000, and the application of the proceeds to a proportionate withdrawal of its notes from circulation. 4. The annual contraction of its remaining paper circulation. 5. The payment to the bank for the state notes it used in accordance with its primitive contract, in withdrawing from circulation about £1,237,500 by the substitution of bank notes by state notes, and the discharge of an insignificant amount of treasury bonds cashed by the bank. 6. The issue and payment of floating debt and those treasury bonds of state notes to the amount of notes withdrawn by the bank. Thus the government were supplied with coin for remittances to the army and navy engaged in war with Paraguay, and the Bank of Brazil was reduced to a mercantile association. So it now remains, only a small and scarce portion of its notes having forced circulation, and that small portion is being greatly reduced. Thus, too, the exclusive functions of providing for the circulating medium were restored to the state, instead of being confided to a bank on which were at times painfully and mischievously exercised the exigencies of internal credit, and the reaction in Brazil of those crises in Europe and the United States that affected the Brazilian Empire, while its currency was in so unsound a condition, with great violence. In 1867, the increasing pecuniary requirements of the war compelled the General Assembly to vote the government a credit of 50,000 contos, £5,625,000, which have in great part been used by the government. But, inserted in the law which authorized the issue, it is a provision that on the termination of the war, the legislature will fix in the budget of each year the necessary amount to be applied to the withdrawal of this addition to the state notes. It was not, however, only by further emissions of state notes that the General Assembly in 1867 made provision for the extraordinary expenditure of the government. In that session, old taxes were increased, new sources of taxation opened up, and the whole system of taxation was reorganized in a more rational and scientific way, greatly to the increase of the general revenue of the empire. So much so that in the session of 1868, the budget for 1869-70 showed under the influence of greatly enlarged receipts and of economies effected in the various departments of the state, an important surplus. And while thus placing the paper circulation on the more solid basis of national security, important reforms were effected in the same session of 1867 in the coinage of the empire. Owing to the fineness of the silver coinage, a fall in the foreign exchanges was immediately followed by the exportation of silver from Brazil to the great inconvenience of petty commerce. so in September 1867, for the silver coinage of Brazil was adopted, in respect of the coins of 2 milreis, 4 pounds 6 pennies, and milreis, 2 pounds 3 pennies, the fineness and weight introduced by the International Convention between France and other countries. And the government substituted for the old copper coinage bronze pieces of 20 reis, half penny, and 10 reis, quarter penny, of a similar alloy to that of our present bronze coinage, viz. 95 parts of copper, 4 of tin, and 1 of zinc, so that the Brazilian coinage consists of gold pieces of 20 and 10 milreis of 917 milliomes, legal tender for any amount, that is, of 27 pennies per milreis, and of these silver and copper pieces for tokens. In addition, English sovereigns and half-sovereigns are also legal tenders for any amount in Brazil. On the change of ministry in July 1868, which led to the formation of the cabinet over which Viscount Itaboraí now presides, the Chamber of Deputies, by an unexpected and sudden combination of forces previously adverse to each other, came to a resolution which left the newly formed cabinet no alternative but an appeal at once to the nation, and that without the Chamber making full financial provision for the conduct of the war. Left in this position by no fault of its own, the cabinet in September 1868 had no alternative but the adoption of financial operations on its own responsibility. But they have fortunately met with the full approval of the country, and will no doubt be sanctioned by the result of the now impending general election of deputies. These measures were of an alternative character. First of all, they consisted of a decree authorizing a further issue of state notes to the amount of 40,000 contos, viz. £4,500,000. But this decree was followed by another empowering the Treasury to raise a domestic gold loan of 30,000 contos, £3,335,000. The former decree was, however, only intended to support the credit of the government, in the event of the failure of the loan authorized by the latter decree, and as it has been successful, a further issue of state notes will, it may be anticipated, be averted to any considerable amount. In explanation of these measures, it is necessary to state that the pressure of the war expenditure going on since April 1865 had led, under the previous cabinet of Senor Zacharias, to the creation of a large floating debt, represented by treasury bonds, issued for various short periods. There is always in Rio de Janeiro a large amount of loanable capital seeking interest on temporary investment, which it had found previously to the crisis of 1864 in the deposits of private bankers' establishments. This loanable capital, deprived of such resource after the crisis of that year, found better and safe temporary shelter in treasury bonds. And obtaining money in this way to carry on the war, the preceding cabinet was able to avoid new permanent operations for supplying the means for its necessities. The wants of the government so supplied, however, deprived commerce of part of its legitimate supplies of money and made the situation of the treasury precarious and hazardous. The extent, too, of temporary resources of this kind had obviously reached their limit. It was, therefore, partly to extinguish a large amount of this floating debt, and so to relieve the Treasury from any embarrassment that might arise from failure in the renewal of Treasury bonds when at maturity, and partly to provide for the exigencies of the war, that the government in September 1868 resorted to the internal loan of 30,000 contos, £3,335,000, issued at 90%, in bonds bearing 6% interest payable in gold, redeemable in 33 years by purchase when under par, and drawing when at or above par, in which last case payment to be made in gold. This loan was so favorably received that applications for it were received in Rio only to the extent of 105,000 contos, and it quickly rose to a premium of 7%. Again, then, complete success has attended the financial policy of Viscount Itaboraí, and the Treasury has been provided with the means of discharging a large amount of floating debt and of prosecuting the war. In spite of the provisions adopted by the legislation and of the concurrent necessary activity of Brazilian commerce, the exchanges in London after the crisis of 1864, though high in reference to the overissue of inconvertible paper, had fallen, and in February 1868 declined, as if in panic, to 14 pennies. This fall was partly due to the remittances to England of bills for purchasing gold and honoring the government commitments on this side, and still more to the large orders from the plate for operations in exchange and purchases of bullion here caused by the financial crisis of Montevideo. This decline in the rate of exchange on London was, however, brief. Thanks principally to the financial measures just described and to the improving prospects of the war, the rate has again risen and is still rising. Such, in necessarily brief and rough outlines, is the history of the circulating medium of the Brazilian Empire. Everything, it will be seen, conduces to the conviction that with the close of the war and expenditure there will be a certainty of maintaining the standard of 1846, so solemnly reproduced in the laws of 1853, 1860, and 1867, and in the internal loan of 1868, and that the foreign exchange will once more rise, in the interests of commerce and of all domestic industries, to above the legal level so fixed in 1846. When this has been accomplished, it will be recognized, and be due to an intelligent and prudent administration of the finances, to the prodigious development of the external commerce, and to the inexhaustible resources of the great American monarchy. End of section 27.
Section 28 of Brazil and the River Plate in 1868. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Brazil and the River Plate in 1868 by William Hadfield. Argentine Finances. A notice of this extensive and rising country would be incomplete without some allusion to its financial condition, and in order to illustrate this more clearly, I must revert to the year 1824, when the first loan of £1,000,000 was raised in London to assist the young Republic in meeting the expenses incurred during the War of Independence. That the money thus obtained was more or less squandered, and did not find its way into legitimate channels, is probable enough. Nevertheless, the liability was always admitted by the existing governments, although interest had ceased to be paid on the loan for upwards of 20 years, and the original stock was almost worthless. At the period I allude to, the revenue and resources of the country were small, and during the reign of Rojas they were entirely under his private direction, and the national means spent according to his will. In fact, what is now known as the Argentine Republic had no existence until after the downfall of Rojas in 1852. Buenos Aires, up to that period, exercising sovereign control. A heavy internal debt, represented by paper money, had also generally reduced the value of the dollar, originally worth about 4 shillings, to 2 pence, and there appeared little chance of the English bondholders ever obtaining again the money lent in 1824 through the agency of Messrs. Baring, Brothers and Company. But on the downfall of Rojas, a new era dawned upon the Republic. Many illustrious citizens who had been obliged to expatriate themselves in order to save their lives returned to Buenos Aires, and the principles of constitutional government were again infused into the body politic, subject, however, to many vicissitudes, which for a time retarded internal progress and prevented the real resources of the country from being profitably utilized. So soon as these difficulties were overcome, the question of its indebtedness forced itself upon the executive and legislative powers, who wisely decided that their first great financial effort should be to come to some understanding with their English creditors. At the same time, a movement was set on foot by the bondholders themselves, and a committee was formed in London under the auspices of Messrs. Baring, Brothers and Company, comprising some of the largest bondholders. Negotiations were entered into with the Buenos Aires government, who evinced every disposition to meet the matter fairly, and eventually in the year 1857 an arrangement was come to by which the original debt in full, with its accumulated interest, was consolidated, and interest agreed to be paid thereon, and this arrangement has been most faithfully adhered to up to the present hour. The decree in which this honourable recognition of a great principle is contained is dated the 12th December, 1857, and is signed by the Governor Felipe Flavaflol and Norberto de la Riestra, the then Minister of Finance. I insert a copy of the document itself. Ministry of Finance, Buenos Aires, November 20th, 1857. The government of the State of Buenos Aires, in virtue of the authorization conferred upon it by the law of the 28th of October last, has made the following arrangement with Mr. George E. White, representative of Messrs. Baring, Brothers and Company, agents of the loan contracted in London in 1824 for settlement of the said debt. Videlicet, Article 1st, to meet the payment of the interest upon the original bonds, the government of Buenos Aires engages to remit to the loan in London in 1857 the sum of £36,000, 1858 £48,000, 1859 60,000, and from after 1860, inclusive, besides the above-mentioned sum of £60,000, it will also remit annually the sum of £5,000 as a redemption fund. This sum, together with the interest of the shares redeemed, or that may be redeemed, shall be employed 1/2 each 6 months in the purchase or redemption of the new bonds of this class till the whole of them have been redeemed. The funds corresponding to the stipulated remittances shall be placed in London, 1/2 before the 30th of June, and the other half before the 31st of December in each year. Article 2nd. The sums appropriated to the redemption shall be employed by the agents of the London loan in the purchase of bonds in the market at the current price, so long as that is less than par, but should the price of the bonds exceed par, the funds to be redeemed by the redemption fund shall be determined by lot, in presence of the principal agent or representative of the State of Buenos Aires existing in London. The bonds drawn by lot shall be published in the Gazette or 2 of the London journals, stating the day on which payment will be made at par and from which date they will cease to bear interest. The bonds purchased or redeemed by the redemption fund with their corresponding future dividends of interest shall be cancelled in presence of the principal agent or representative of the State of Buenos Aires in London and immediately deposited in the Bank of England, publishing their numbers in the Gazette or in 2 of the principal London journals. Article 3rd. The holders of the original bonds shall receive a new list of debentures for their future dividends, with a copy annexed to it of the 2 preceding articles, beginning with the debenture for the dividend that falls due on the 12th of January, 1861. Article 4th. For the interest due upon the original bonds up to this date, and for those that fall due to the end of 1858, amounting to the sum of £1,641,000, the Government of Buenos Aires shall emit new bonds to bear interest at the following rates, vide. Article 5th. From 1861 to 1865 inclusive, 1% per annum. From 1866 to 1870 inclusive, 2%, and from and after 1871, 3%. The first half-yearly dividend upon these new bonds shall fall due on the 12th July, 1871, and subsequently on the 12th January and 12th July of each year, on which days the half-yearly installments or dividends due shall be paid in London. All the guarantees accorded to the original bonds shall be extensive to these new bonds. Article 6. The Government of Buenos Aires engages to remit to the agents of the loan in London the funds necessary for meeting the payment of the interest assigned to these new bonds, and moreover, from and after 1871, the sum of £8,205, or, say, the 200th part of the total amount of the said bonds, as a redemption fund for them. This sum, together with the interest of the bonds that have been redeemed, shall be employed in equal proportion every 6 months in the purchase or redemption of these new bonds, till the whole of them have been redeemed. Accordingly, the sums that must be remitted to meet the interest and redemption fund shall be as follows, vide. From 1861 to 1865 inclusive, £24,615 annually. From 1866 to 1870 inclusive, £41,025, and from and after 1871, the sum of £47,435, the Government engaging to place these funds in London, 1/2 before the 30th June, and the other half before the 31st December of each year. The Government reserves to itself the right of employing in the redemption of these new bonds, over and above the sum stipulated, any further sums the Legislature may appropriate to this purpose. Article 7th. The sums applicable to the redemption fund, as also the others that may be destined to this purpose, shall be employed by the agents of the loan in London to the purchase of these new bonds in the market at the current price, always that this is less than par. But in case the price of these bonds should come to exceed par, the bonds that are to be redeemed shall be determined by lot, and those that are drawn by lot, as also those purchased in the market, shall be published in the journals, paid and cancelled on the respective debentures in the manner and form established in the second article in respect to the 6% bonds. Article 8. The new bonds shall be denominated 3%. Buenos Aires bonds shall be signed in the name of the state by the Minister of Finance in Buenos Aires, and shall be emitted through the medium of Messrs. Baring Brothers and Company of London, by whom they shall be countersigned. Article 9th. The payments stipulated in the present convention are specially assigned upon the products of the rents of the public lands of the state, excepting those belonging to the municipalities, and in case of deficiency, this shall be made up from the general rents of the state, or from the special resources created by the legislature for the purpose. The conduct of Buenos Aires statesmen in respect to the obligations referred to was fully appreciated in this country, and the bonds gradually rose up to par value, holding, even during the great monetary crisis, a good position. Nor must it be lost sight of that, although the original debt was incurred for the benefit of the entire Confederation, yet the province of Buenos Aires alone took upon itself the sole responsibility, and up to the present Confederation with the other Argentine provinces always paid the interest out of its provincial resources. Subsequent to the settlement of the English debt, what is known as the national government was formed, and the internal debt of the entire provinces has been consolidated into a national stock, bearing interest at 6%, which is punctually paid, and the stock, from being worth 30 to 40 a few years back, has latterly risen to 55, subject, of course, to fluctuations generally caused by speculation on the Bolsa of Buenos Aires, where for a long period gambling in paper money was the chief business, until a wise measure of Governor Alsina, in establishing an exchange office and fixing a paper value for gold, put a stop to this element of financial and social disturbance. As already mentioned, there is a provincial revenue and a national revenue, as well as expenditure, that of Buenos Aires being the most important from its great commercial wealth. Until recently, the only bonds known here were those of Buenos Aires. Now we have what are called Argentine bonds, lately issued on the security of the national government, and in order to show the nature of this latter security, as well as the progressive state of the national revenue, I cannot do better than quote the following figures, issued by their able representative minister, His Excellency Don Norberto de la Riestra, in a circular dated 1st June last, at the time he was negotiating this important transaction. In 1864, the general national revenue amounted to $7,005,328, or £1,401,065. In 1865, it reached $8,295,071, or £1,659,014. In 1866, $9,568,554, or £1,913,711. In 1867, the yield is estimated at £2,600,000, it having produced in the first 8 months of the year $8,981,430. The revenue estimates for 1868 amount to £2,647,200, as follows. Ordinary import duties, $7,650,000. Ordinary export duties, $2,070,000. Storage dues, $350,000. Stamps, $160,000. Post office and miscellaneous, $206,000. Totaling $10,436,000. Additional customs duties, $2,800,000. Totaling $13,236,000, or £2,647,200. The budget of ordinary expenditure for 1868 amounts to £1,581,649, as follows. Ministry of the Interior, $901,079. Ministry of Foreign Affairs, $99,538. Ministry of Finance, $729,491. Ministry of Justice, etc., $487,940. Ministry of War and Marine, $3,116,593. Service of Public Debt, $573,626, totaling $7,908,267, or £1,581,649. The surplus revenue over ordinary expenditure is applied to defray the extraordinary war expenses. The above revenue is distinct and independent of the private revenues, both state and municipal, of the different provinces of the Republic, which are raised for local purposes. The public debt of the Republic at this time is as follows. External: Old Buenos Aires debt, London loan of 1824, now in charge of the nation, say. Original 6%, stock, £905,800, deferred 3%, due £1,110,900. Argentine 6% loan of 1866, £540,000. Total £2,556,700. Internal consolidated 6% Argentine stock, $12,839,535, or £2,567,907. Buenos Aires public stock in paper currency, £596,988. Paraná debt, 1858, including interest, £433,309. Obligation to foreign creditors, £18,852. Loan from the Brazilian government, 1851, £228,541. Loan from Brazilian government, 1865 to 66, £400,000. Total, £4,245,597. There is besides a floating debt in Treasury bills to a moderate amount, which is being rapidly cancelled. I think this statement, combined with the facts I have elsewhere given from personal experience and observation as to the rapidly extending commerce of the Argentine Confederation, will fully bear out the favourable impression that is now gaining ground in England and in Europe generally as to the bona fide security presented by Argentine bonds. And I must say that, looking back to the conscientious course pursued by the government, no country in the world deserves more to enjoy the confidence of British capitalists. It will be seen from Senor Riestra's statement that the only foreign debt of the Argentine Republic is that due to English bondholders. Her internal debt is due chiefly to her own citizens, who are safe to be paid both principal and interest, nor has any act of repudiation or compromise ever strained the character of the Argentine people. The pursuance of this praiseworthy conduct has been followed by the investment of British capital in promoting railways and other industrial enterprises. Indeed, look around in whatever direction we may, it is difficult to find a more pleasing illustration of the maxim that honesty is the best policy than that exhibited by the Argentine Republic. End of section 28. Read near Montreal by Sandra, 2024.
Section 29 of Brazil and the River Plate in 1868. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Brazil and the River Plate in 1868 by William Hadfield. Town and Harbour of Santos. Before recording the details of my passage home, I wish to say a few words more with regard to the rising port of Santos, a notice of which has been accidentally omitted in a former part of my work. Its connection with the Sao Paulo Railway and the fact of its being the shipping port of the province renders Santos of much future importance. The distance from Rio de Janeiro is about 200 miles, and the navigation is simple enough, in fact in sight of land the whole way, the seacoast ridge of mountains being conspicuous. The only danger is from the Alcatraces rocks, which lie some distance to the eastward of Santos, and very ugly customers they are, towering a considerable height above the sea. Steamers can, however, have no difficulty in avoiding them after getting hold of the island of Sao Sebastian, from the point at which the Santos light becomes visible, and can be seen at a distance of 20 miles, but coasting craft require to keep a good lookout at night. The light is placed on an island of some elevation, covered with trees to the summit, and it has a very picturesque appearance. Rounding a bluff point, you enter at once what appears to be a river channel, though it is an estuary, for Santos is really an island. The passage is winding, and the land on either side is covered with shrubby vegetation, the distance up 4 miles, with deep water for vessels of 1,000 tons. There are some scattered houses on the beach, chiefly used by sea-bathing residents, and on one side is an antiquated-looking fort, supposed at one time to have guarded the entrance of the estuary, a specimen of early Portuguese defenses, and on the island of Santos are the remains of the old town of São Vicente, the first founded on this part of the coast. The anchorage opposite the town is convenient and well protected. Several wharves extend out where vessels lie alongside to discharge and load cargo, and at the custom house there is an iron pontoon used for the same purpose. At this wharf the steamer I came down in, 1,000 tons burden, received a full cargo and sailed within 3 days, a feat without parallel in any other port of Brazil. There is some pretty scenery around Santos. On the coast side a range of hills, and opposite to the town, across the estuary, rise the bold mountain ranges covered with verdure. It is a pleasant ride round the base of the hills on the seaside until you come to the town of São Vicente. The railway is laid along a swampy marsh, running parallel and close to the old São Paulo road until it crosses the bridge of Cbteddy, which connects the island and the main land. The town itself is long and straggling, containing from 8,000 to 10,000 inhabitants, with some fine warehouses or stores for storing coffee, cotton, or other country produce previous to shipment. At the extremity of the town is the railway station, a commodious building, having wharves alongside of which vessels can come, and opposite to the station is what looks like a palace with 2 wings in a center, the outside almost entirely lined with ornamental blue Lisbon tiles, and the whole bearing an appearance quite out of keeping with the general features of the place. It is the costly hobby of an old Portuguese merchant, and intended for his own residence, but it progresses very slowly toward completion. The streets are paved with roughish stones not easy for a novice to walk on, but a great improvement on the sandy element which formerly characterized primitive Brazilian streets. The class of buildings is generally solid, and there are some good well-stocked shops. There is also a theater on a very diminutive scale, where I went to see an amusing amateur performance, but the heat was stifling. Nevertheless, it was quite full, and some well-dressed and sprightly young ladies formed part of the audience, and did not appear to be very much troubled by the not very aromatic flavor of the atmosphere. It was a relief to get into the fresh air for a few minutes between the acts. Santos is not to be judged by its present status, but by what the railway must make it, and a few years will produce a very great change, further accelerated by the introduction of gas, water, and drainage, which are here much needed, as well as in the city of São Paulo. There is a specialty about the old Brazilian towns that one cannot help being struck with, and they present a striking contrast when railway innovation comes to disturb the slumbrous habits of the people. As a seaport and a rising town, Santos is deserving of this additional notice, and I may observe its close proximity to the sea renders it exceedingly healthy. End of section 29.
Section 30 of Brazil and the River Plate in 1868. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mario Pineda. Brazil and the River Plate in 1868 by William Hadfield. Mr. Perkins on Emigration. In the elaborate and interesting report of Mr. William Perkins, who was at the head of a recent government expedition to El Rey, an old Spanish settlement in the Gran Chaco, occurs the following remarks. The northern part of the province of Santa Fe is justly considered the most important, being so highly favored by nature. And in truth, the Creator has here scattered with a prodigal hand all the elements capable of attracting population and industry. For these reasons, it saddens the heart to see these magnificent lands deserted, teeming as they do with natural riches. Mighty rivers and streams cross each other in all directions. First-class timber in the woods to an extent the eye cannot reach. Picturesque meadows of rich pasture. In a word, whatever can be desired for agricultural and industrial pursuits. Mr. Perkins has been one of the most active and intelligent agents in the cause of emigration to the Argentine Republic, and so soon as the land transfers of the Central Argentine Railway are completed, the company intended to send him to the United States and to England for the purpose of making arrangements and to bring out people to occupy their land, a desirable step which will at once enhance its value and that of the immense tracts by which it is surrounded. The peculiar feature of this railway is the territory attached to the concession, namely, a league on each side of the line, comprising a total of about 1 million of acres, one half of which is the property of the contractors, the other half belonging to the shareholders, who have, besides, the national guarantee of 7% on the capital of £1,600,000, which the railway is to cost of about £6,500 per mile. It is perhaps one of the easiest railways in the world to make, the chief expense being the rails and rolling stock, few earthworks or ordinary sleepers being required. As I have before noticed, there is plenty of wood higher up the country, about Villanueva, where a large quantity of sleepers of excellent quality were being prepared to complete the line to Córdoba. In Mr. Perkins' report just alluded to are some very graphic descriptions of the riverine facilities, at present so little known or availed of, but it is to be hoped when he revisits those scenes, after utilizing his services at home, he will return to see progress already made, and some at least of the lands of the Central Argentine Railway occupied by thriving settlers. It only requires encouragement and a beginning to be made, which I believe will not long be delayed. The Argentine government has come forward to assist the Argentine Railway by an issue of bonds for £300,000, the contractors supplying the remaining £300,000, which, with £1 million in shares when the company was formed, completed the capital. The timely assistance thus rendered by the government is an earnest of their desire to see this great work accomplished, in which the welfare of the upper provinces is so deeply concerned, as there are no navigable rivers running westward to Córdoba, the Paraná and the Paraguay, tending northward into Paraguay and Mato Grosso. It follows, as a matter of course, that a large portion of the produce of these western provinces will find its way to Córdoba and to the railway, amongst them many articles which have never yet been brought down to Rosario or Buenos Aires on account of the great cost of transit. Reverting to Mr. Perkins, his services in the cause of exploration of the country have been very valuable, and few there are better acquainted with the facilities it presents for emigration when once centers of population are established by this main trunk railway from Rosario to Córdoba. End of section 30. Section 31 of Brazil and the River Plate in 1868. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mario Pineda. Brazil and the River Plate in 1868 by William Hadfield. My Voyage Home. My visit has been prolonged by unforeseen events, but I am on my way home again on board the steamer City of Buenos Aires, commanded by my old friend Captain Peters, also belonging to Tate's Line, which has experienced some of the incidents and drawbacks peculiar to the formation of new companies, but from the spirit manifested by that firm, there is every prospect of the enterprise proving a successful one. The rapid increase of passenger trade to the River Plate is a notable fact that has to be provided for, independent of that to Brazil, which continues to assume larger proportions, and steamers now will get the preference of freight both ways. 2 days after the storm at Buenos Aires, to which I have referred in another place, the vessel was enabled to complete her cargo and to get underway at 9 p.m. on the 19th June, reaching Montevideo at 11 a.m. on the following day. There was a fresh breeze blowing, which rendered boating somewhat hazardous and prevented our leaving the harbor until 8 a.m. on Sunday the 21st, when we steamed down the river past Maldonada, and after 5 days we once more entered the Bay of Rio de Janeiro, where several men of war were at anchor. As we passed the American frigate Guerrière, the bank struck up "God Save the Queen" in compliment to our captain, who was a friend of the American admiral. Her Majesty's ship Narcissus, with Admiral Ramsay on board, was also lying in the harbor with the American steamer Kearsarge, which terminated the career of the world-famed cruiser Alabama in the combat off Cherbourg. The weather was beautifully fine, clear, and pleasant at Rio, very different from that I had experienced a few months previously, and rendered the 2 days on shore very agreeable. I had a busy time of it, seeing and taking leave of all friends, but managed to get through and embarked on Sunday afternoon. We sailed down the harbor again, passing the men of war, officers and crews of which were collected on deck, and returned our salutation. Captain Wilson, flag captain of the Narcissus, lunched on board us, with some of the officers, and a number of other friends of the passengers were on board before we started. We passed the fort at 5 p.m., when they very politely hoisted the number, "Wish you a good voyage." The scenery of the bay looked, if possible, more magnificent than ever, under the influence of the setting sun, the outline of mountains being so clearly and vividly portrayed. A few could leave so grand a scene without a feeling of admiration and regret. Our passengers were a mixed group, including about a dozen children of various ages, of different nationalities: English, Scotch, Irish, Belgian, Dutch, and Germans, so almost all languages were spoken on board. Some English families were returning from a residence of some years in the campus of Buenos Aires, not very well pleased with the result of their speculation in sheep farming, which has no doubt been a bad one of late, but I could not find from their report that they had undergone any particular hardships, besides which they had other reasons for returning home. As I have before observed, it is a mistake for people to go out to the River Plate to commence sheep farming under the idea that they can realize a fortune and retire in a few years. They must make up their minds to rough it and to persevere as they would have to do at home in a similar occupation. We had favorable weather and crossed the line on the 8th day after leaving Rio, expecting to reach St. Vincent, our only place of call between Rio and Falmouth, on the 10th of July, say 13 days out, which is pretty fair work for a steamer with only moderate power and carrying a large cargo. We passed many vessels knocking about in what sailors call the doldrums, various winds and calms which prevail between the northeast and southeast trades, and amused ourselves with exchanging signals with several of them, getting their names, destination, etc. The monotony of a sea voyage is always relieved by incidents of this kind, and making land, the latter generally created much excitement. We got into the harbor of St. Vincent about 8 p.m. on the evening of Saturday the 11th of July, in time to be visited, and I went on shore to spend the night with Mr. Miller at his country place up in the mountains, about 2.5 miles distant from the consulate. It was dark, of course, but Mr. Miller's son led the way on a pony, and I followed him on another, the ascent being rather steep as we approached the house, which is very nicely perched on ground leveled on a spur of the mountain, and called Aria, from the dark brown color of the hills. Sleeping at an elevation of 800 feet was a pleasant change after the rocking motion and closeness of the steamer's cabin, and on looking out of my window early next morning, there was a charming view of the little harbour and the picturesque mountains on all sides of it, wanting only verdure to constitute an agreeable picture. Everything was burnt up from the want of rain, which is expected about this time, when I believe the island wears quite a cheerful aspect, though for a short time only. After breakfast, we rode down to the consulate, where I spent a portion of the day, instead of being on board during the delightful operation of coaling, when everything is covered with coal dust. Mr. Miller has a farm on the other side of the island, where he is cultivating vines, fruits, and vegetables, having a supply of water on the spot, the most difficult of all things to find, and he has, by means of a large tank, brought a supply into the town. I have before alluded to the great advantage presented by St. Vincent as a coaling station and to the facilities Mr. Miller has provided to carry it on, which he is continually adding to. A steamer can take on board 200 to 300 tons of coal in a few hours, and lately the Tamer, on her way home from the Cape, took in upwards of 600 tons during daylight. It was Sunday again when we were there, a constant recurrence during the last 6 months, when I have been so often in and out of ports, but we were cold and all ready to start by 5 p.m. Unfortunately, some little repairs to the boiler tubes were not completed, and we did not get up steam until 1 a.m. on Monday morning, thus losing several hours. The night was fine, and we soon got again into the open sea on our way to Falmouth, steaming against the northeast trade. The Zaire, Portuguese mail steamer from Africa, came into St. Vincent on Sunday for a small supply of coal, sailing again in a few hours. The only other vessels were a small paddle wheel steamer bound to Bahia, intended for the navigation of the bay, and 2 vessels discharging coal. At times there is quite a little fleet there, and a good many steamers are shortly expected to call with troops on their way back from the Abyssinian expedition. 4 days' hard tugging against the strong northeast trade has diminished our hopes of a tolerably quick passage. During the many passages I have made, I do not recollect such strong trades at this season of the year. Our progress has, in consequence, been very slow, not averaging more than 150 miles in the 24 hours, and the only amusement, if it can be called such, is to exchange signals with vessels passing us, going along with the wind right aft, and all sail set. It is steaming against these northeast trades that generally renders the homeward passage so much longer than the outward one, unless a steamer has great power. Still, it is an immense stride over the old days of sailing ships, which generally took 50 or 60 days home from Rio, and often more. The trim of the vessel being rather too much by the head, some cargo has been removed from the fore to the afterhold, and the top-gallant jars struck, offering less resistance to the wind. 2 more days of trade winds, dead against us, the time being only relieved by passing a large number of sailing ships and exchanging signals with them. It would appear as if they had experienced some detention in crossing the bay, and that a considerable fleet had reached the latitude of Madeira in time to avail of the strong northeast trades between Madeira and St. Vincent. Sunday, 19th July, we passed close to the island of Madeira, topped with clouds, preventing our seeing more than the outline, and the verdure and cultivation lies on the eastern side. Still, it is an event that breaks the monotony of a voyage. Before this day week, if all is well, we hope to reach Falmouth. On Thursday, 23rd July, after 3 days of almost complete calm, with scarcely a ripple or movement on the water at times, looking for a favorable breeze to waft us to Falmouth, this morning our old friend, the persevering northeaster, came on again right in the middle of the Bay of Biscay, and we were compelled to steam head to wind, with a considerable sea getting up. At this season of the year, westerly winds generally prevail in these latitudes, but we have not met with any, nor been able to make any use of our canvas from the latitudes of 10 degrees north. Numerous sailing vessels keep passing us with studding sails set, but there is no help for it. From this day up to the time of our making Falmouth on the morning of Sunday, the 26th, it blew almost a gale with a nasty rough sea against which our progress was very slow. We steamed into the harbour on a miserably cold, wet day, but the fields about appeared burnt up for want of moisture, and we learned that the weather had been exceedingly hot. I did not find the railway hotel much improved as regards board and attendance, which is a great pity, as it is a spacious, comfortable house situated in one of the most picturesque spots in England, and would be very attractive with better management. Note 9. A life in the camp may not be very agreeable, or such as is experienced on a farm at home. People have to put up with a good deal if they wish to better their condition, and remember that it is not always a matter of choice, but of necessity, which compels them to seek their fortunes in a foreign country. Those who can live comfortably or find suitable occupation at home should remain there. One of the great drawbacks to the success of young Englishmen out in the camp is, I am sorry to say, the terrible propensity to indulgence in the free use of ardent spirits, which soon enfeebles their constitution and often leads to an untimely grave. This a little self-denial would soon enable them to avoid. Several of these melancholy instances occurred during my short stay in the country. The climate itself is sufficiently stimulating without the excitement arising from the brandy bottle, the use of which, even in towns and cities, is often carried to excess. As a rule, the natives are sober and set a good example to foreigners in this respect if they would only profit by it. End of section 31.